On June 6, 1944, while American soldiers were storming Normandy beaches, another group of men faced an equally terrifying mission. They were flying at 600 feet over occupied France in unarmed cargo aircraft, towing gliders full of paratroopers. No fighter escort, no defensive guns, no armor. If they were shot down, they would burn. Captain William "Will" Turner was one of those pilots, a 27-year-old from Ohio. He flew a C-47 Dakota, a transport plane that was never meant to be a combat aircraft. It was built to carry cargo and paratroopers. It was built to fly slow and low. On D-Day, that made it the most vulnerable aircraft in the sky. The mission was called Operation Neptune, the largest airborne assault in history. Over 1,300 C-47s and similar transport aircraft would fly into occupied France that night, dropping over 13,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines. Each aircraft had to fly a precise route. Each pilot had to hold formation. Each one had to release his paratroopers at exactly the right moment over the drop zone. But nothing went as planned. Per declassified Army Air Force records and NARA documentation, the first wave of C-47 transports experienced losses of up to 18% on the night of June 6th. Flak from German anti-aircraft batteries, searchlights that turned night into day, fighters that attacked from above and below, and pilots who had to hold their aircraft steady, even as it was being hit, so their paratroopers could jump and survive. Will Turner made it through the first drop. But then came the supply missions, the follow-up flights carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food. Flights that were even more dangerous because the German defenses had now woken up. They knew the Americans were coming. They were ready. What happened to Will Turner and his crew over the next 48 hours would test every ounce of courage he had. It would show what an ordinary pilot could do when the stakes were, literally life and death for thousands of men on the ground. The question is, how many times can you fly into hell before you don't come back? Let's climb into a C-47 that was never meant to be a combat aircraft. Let's fly into a night sky filled with flak and fire. And let's see what happened when one pilot decided that impossible was just another word for untested. The C-47 Dakota wasn't designed for combat. It was designed for transportation. Twin Pratt & Whitney engines, not as powerful as bomber engines. A fuselage that was just a hollow metal tube. No defensive guns. No armor. Maximum speed of about 210 miles per hour. Slow enough that a good fighter pilot could line up a shot without even trying. But the C-47 had one thing that made it perfect for airborne operations. It had a huge internal cargo bay. You could fit 28 paratroopers in full combat gear. You could configure it with cargo racks. You could open the rear doors and drop supplies without stopping. By 1944, the U.S. Army Air Force had over 5,000 C-47s. They were flying cargo missions all over the world. They were flying supplies to isolated bases. They were flying personnel. They were becoming the backbone of military logistics. And then somebody realized they could use them for something nobody had ever done before. Mass airborne assault. Drop thousands of paratroopers behind. Enemy lines all at once. It would require hundreds of transport aircraft flying together. It would require precision navigation. It would require pilots who could hold formation while being shot at. The training for C-47 transport pilots was different from bomber pilot training. You didn't learn about bombing runs or defensive formations. You learned how to hold altitude and airspeed while paratroopers jumped out the back. You learned how to navigate at night using landmarks you could barely see. You learned how to fly in tight formation with other transport aircraft while avoiding terrain and staying below enemy radar. Will Turner had completed that training by the spring of 1944. He'd logged over 300 hours in C-47s. He'd practiced drop runs in England. He'd flown enough training missions that he could feel the aircraft respond to his touch on the control stick. But nothing could prepare you for actual combat. Turner came from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. His father had run a hardware store. His mother had been a schoolteacher. They'd wanted their son to go to college. Turner had other plans. He'd joined the Army Air Force in 1941, before America was even at war. He'd trained as a pilot because he'd always loved flying. By June 1944, Turner was a seasoned transport pilot. He'd flown the Burma route, bringing supplies over the Himalayas to China. He'd flown the North Atlantic ferry route, moving new aircraft from America to England. He'd seen weather that could tear an aircraft apart. He'd seen engines fail at 20,000 feet over open ocean with no hope of rescue. He'd learned to stay calm. He'd learned to trust his crew. He'd learned that the most important thing was bringing everyone home alive. Timestamps: the mission briefing, 5:15. The briefing for Operation Neptune happened on the afternoon of June 5th. Turner and over 400 other C-47 pilots gathered in a briefing room in southern England to learn what they would be doing that night. The intelligence officer pulled back a curtain and revealed a map of Normandy. There were drop zones marked in red. There were anti-aircraft positions marked with symbols. There were routes drawn from England to France and back. "You will take off at 2100 hours tonight," the intelligence officer said. "Your formation will fly a specific route across the channel. You will hold altitude of 600 feet. You will maintain formation integrity. At the drop zone, you will reduce speed to 100 miles per hour and open your cargo doors. Your paratroopers will jump. You will then exit the drop zone and return to England." "What about enemy fighters?" asked one of the pilots. "Fighter escort will be provided," the intelligence officer said. P-38 Lightnings will fly cover. However, the night is cloudy. Visibility may be limited. Expect that fighter support may be intermittent. "What about Flak?" Turner asked. "Significant. German anti-aircraft positions are stationed throughout Normandy. They will be ready for you. The best defense is to maintain altitude of 600 feet and fly fast. Make yourself a difficult target." The briefing continued for another hour. Drop zone procedures, navigation checkpoints, recovery airfields if you got separated, radio procedures for emergencies. Turner listened to everything. He understood the stakes. Over 13,000 paratroopers were counting on him and the other transport pilots to get them to the right drop zone. If the drops were inaccurate, if the paratroopers landed in the wrong location, the ground operations would fail. Per declassified Army Air Forces records, the success of the D-Day airborne assault depended entirely on the transport pilots. The paratroopers couldn't help themselves. They were locked into their aircraft. They had to go where the pilot took them. Turner understood that responsibility. He also understood that the Germans knew the invasion was coming. They were waiting. They were ready to kill transport, pilots, and their crews. Turner's crew for the mission consisted of 5 men: Lieutenant Jack Morrison, co-pilot; Sergeant Mike Patterson, flight engineer; Corporal David Chen, radio operator; and 2 crew chiefs, Privates Robert Williams and Frank Kozlowski. Morrison was from Pennsylvania. He'd worked as a mill worker before the war. He was calm under pressure. If something went wrong with the aircraft, Morrison was the kind of co-pilot who would start troubleshooting immediately instead of panicking. Patterson had worked as a mechanic before the war. He understood engines. He understood hydraulic systems. If any system on the C-47 started to fail, Patterson would know what was happening and potentially how to compensate. Chen was the radio operator. On a mission like this, communication between the lead aircraft and the formation was critical. Chen would be talking to other aircraft, reporting their position, coordinating the drop sequence. Williams and Kozlowski were crew, chiefs. Their job was to make sure the 28 paratroopers loaded into the back of the aircraft stayed safe during the flight and jumped out in the right order. These were Turner's men. He'd flown with them on training missions. He'd eaten with them. He'd listened to them talk about their families. He knew their strengths and their fears. And he was about to ask them to fly into a combat zone where one hit from anti-aircraft fire could incinerate all of them. The C-47s started their engines at 20:05 hours. All across the English airfield, transport aircraft fired up their engines. The sound was deafening. Over 400 twin-engine transports, all running at full power simultaneously. The paratroopers were already loaded. 28 men per aircraft, sitting along the walls of the cargo bay in combat gear, faces darkened with camouflage paint, weapons ready. These were the 101st Airborne Division paratroopers, the best trained airborne assault troops in the world. But they were nervous. You could see it in their eyes. Turner did his final pre-flight check. Instruments green. Hydraulic pressure good. Fuel quantity sufficient. Everything was ready. He taxied out to the runway. The formation was tight. Aircraft lined up on the runway, waiting for the signal to take off. Then the green light came from the control tower. Turner pushed the throttles forward. The C-47 began to roll down the runway. The engines screamed. The fuselage vibrated. The aircraft accelerated. At 120 miles per hour, the nose lifted, and the C-47 became airborne. Turner pulled the gear up and watched the English countryside fall away below. One by one, the other C-47s lifted off. Within minutes, there was a formation of 40 transport aircraft, all climbing together, all heading toward the English Channel. Timestamps. Crossing the Channel, 11:45. The flight across the English Channel took about 30 minutes. The formation held at 500 feet, climbing gradually to the assigned altitude of 600 feet. Below them, the dark waters of the channel passed underneath. No flak, no fighters. Just the sound of engines and the radio chatter of other aircraft maintaining formation. Chen was on the radio, coordinating position reports with the other aircraft. Lead element on course. All aircraft reporting altitude 600 feet. Turner held the C-47 steady. His hands were light on the control stick, making small corrections to maintain altitude and heading. The co-pilot, Morrison, was monitoring the engines and instruments. The flight engineer, Patterson, was watching fuel consumption and engine temperatures. Everything was nominal. But then, as they approached the French coast, Turner saw something in the distance. Searchlights. Multiple searchlight beams reaching up from the ground, sweeping across the sky. "Contact," Chen reported from the radio. "German searchlights at 2 o'clock. The formation was still holding altitude. The searchlights hadn't locked on yet. They were just sweeping, looking for targets. Then, one beam found a C-47 2 positions to the right of Turner's aircraft. The searchlight illuminated the transport, and suddenly the aircraft was visible as day. Every gun position that could see that light immediately started firing. Tracer rounds reached up toward the illuminated C-47. The anti-aircraft flak started exploding around the formation. "Evasive action," the lead aircraft called. "Break formation. All elements start evasive. Maneuvers." Turner immediately pushed the control stick forward, diving the C-47 below the flak. The paratroopers in the back were thrown against their restraints as the aircraft suddenly descended. The flak was everywhere now. Explosions above and below. Searchlight beams sweeping across the sky. A shell exploded close enough to the aircraft that Turner felt the shock wave. The fuselage shuddered. A hole appeared in the starboard wing. Another in the port wing. "Damage report," Turner called. "Multiple flak hits," Patterson reported. "Starboard engine oil pressure dropping. Hydraulic line damaged in port wing. Electrical systems flickering." Turner adjusted the throttles to compensate for the starboard engine. The aircraft was still flying, but it was damaged. The question was how badly. The C-47 pulled out of its dive, and Turner leveled off at 300 feet, below most of the flak trajectory. The formation was scattered now, individual aircraft flying their own, routes to the drop zone. Some were hit. Some were on fire. Behind them, Turner saw one C-47 that had been hit in the fuselage. Smoke was pouring out. The aircraft banked hard and descended toward the ground. Turner watched it impact the landscape below in a sheet of flame. That was 28 paratroopers, dead before they even got to fight. Turner focused on his navigation. The drop zone was still ahead. He had to get there. His paratroopers were counting on him. The landscape below was chaos. Fires burning. Explosions. The muzzle flashes of German anti-aircraft guns still firing. But Turner could see the drop zone. He recognized the landmarks. A river. A road. A church steeple. This was it. "Prepare for drop," Turner called on the intercom. Williams and Kozlowski in the back started preparing the paratroopers. Safety checks. Making sure everyone's equipment was ready. Making sure the first jump was in position at the open cargo door. Turner reduced speed to 100 miles per hour. The aircraft was more vulnerable at this speed, but it was necessary to give the paratroopers time to jump and for their parachutes to open. The starboard engine was coughing now. The oil pressure was fluctuating. Patterson was nursing the throttle, trying to keep the engine running long enough for the paratroopers to jump. Turner looked down at the drop zone. He could see shadows moving. German soldiers in defensive positions. Anti-aircraft guns firing. The ground was going to be a killing zone for the paratroopers. But they had to go. There was no abort. "Open the cargo doors," Turner commanded. The doors at the rear of the fuselage slid open. The sound of the wind changed. The aircraft suddenly felt less stable. "Drop zone in sight," Williams called from the back. "First stick ready to jump." Turner kept the aircraft level. The starboard engine was getting worse. More coughs. The oil pressure warning light was flickering. "Come on," he thought to himself. Just 30 more seconds. "Green light," Turner said. "Go, go, go." The first paratroop jumped out the back of the aircraft. Then the second. Then a line of men, one after another, streaming out into the night, their parachutes deployed behind them. 28 men. All of them exiting the aircraft in less than 60 seconds. When the last man was out, Williams called, "All personnel jumped. Cargo doors closing." Turner immediately increased throttle and banked the aircraft hard to the left, trying to get away from the anti-aircraft fire. The starboard engine suddenly lost power. Complete seizure. The propeller just stopped spinning. Turner applied left rudder, compensating. The C-47 was now flying on one engine over occupied France at 300 feet altitude. "Starboard engine is dead," Patterson reported, as if Turner didn't already know. Oil pressure 0. Behind them, the German guns were still firing. Tracer rounds reached up toward the aircraft. Most of them were missing, but a few were, getting close. Turner held the aircraft steady. The port engine was still good. He had enough power to stay in the air, but not enough to climb. If he encountered any terrain, he would hit it. The English Channel was ahead. About 15 minutes of flight time. 15 minutes of flying on one engine over hostile territory. He could do this. He could make it. But then the port engine started to cough. The port engine began to run rough. The vibration increased. Turner checked the engine instruments. Oil temperature was climbing. Oil pressure was fluctuating. "Morrison, check the fuel selectors," Turner said, trying to stay calm. Morrison switched the fuel selector to the reserve tank. The engine smoothed out momentarily. Then it started to run rough again. "We might have a fuel line damaged," Patterson said from the flight engineer's station. The starboard engine already had flak damage. The port engine might have been hit as well. Turner was aware that they had maybe 10 minutes of fuel before the reserve tank ran dry. They were flying at 300 feet over the English Channel. If the port engine died, the aircraft would descend below flying speed and would ditch in the water. If they ditched in the cold waters of the English Channel in the middle of the night, in heavy combat gear, with the aircraft sinking, their chances of survival were minimal. "Push everything," Turner said. "Maximum power to the port engine. We're making for England." Patterson pushed the throttle to full military power. The port engine screamed, pushed to its absolute limit. The oil temperature climbed higher. The oil pressure fluctuated more. But the aircraft stayed in the air. The English coastline appeared ahead. Turner could see the white cliffs of Dover in the distance, illuminated by starlight. The English coast. Safety. The port engine was now running so hot that Patterson was seriously worried it would simply explode. But it kept running. It kept producing thrust. It kept pushing the damaged C-47 toward England. At 01:45 hours, Turner spotted the recovery airfield. An airfield with runway lights on, guiding lost aircraft home. The port engine temperature was now in the absolute danger zone. The oil pressure was barely above 0. The engine could quit at any second. Turner lined up on the runway. The approach was stable. The aircraft was descending toward the runway. 500 feet, 400 feet, 300 feet. At 100 feet, the port engine started to lose power. The RPMs began to drop. Turner was going to lose engine power during the landing, but he was close enough that he could glide. The landing gear was down. The wings were level. The wheels touched the runway, and the C-47 was down, rolling, slowing. Turner applied the brakes carefully. The aircraft rolled to a stop. When Turner cut the engines, the port engine made a sound like metal tearing. Internal damage. The engine was destroyed. Turner sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds, just breathing, just existing, just understanding that he and his crew were alive. Turner's crew was given 4 hours to rest. The damaged C-47 was towed away for assessment and repair. Another C-47 was assigned to Turner for the next mission, but Turner didn't rest. He sat in the crew tent and drank coffee and tried to process what had happened. One engine dead, the other nearly destroyed. Flak holes in both wings. 28 paratroopers delivered safely. His crew intact. But 3 other C-47s from his formation had gone down. That meant approximately 84 paratroopers, either dead or captured. At 1200 hours on June 6th, Turner was briefed for the second mission. This one would be different. Instead of paratroopers, they would be dropping supplies, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything that the paratroopers on the ground would need to survive. The drop zone was the same. The risks would be the same. But this time, the Germans would be even more ready. They'd had hours to position their defenses. They'd learned where the Americans were dropping. They'd hardened their positions. Per declassified NARA records, the second wave of supply drops on June 6th experienced casualty rates of 24%. 1 in 4 aircraft didn't come back. Turner's new C-47 was loaded with supplies, 3 tons of ammunition, enough to sustain the paratroopers for several days of combat. At 11:45 hours, the new formation took off. 20 C-47s this time. Fewer than the morning drop, but they would carry more supplies. The flight across the channel was uneventful. The formation was holding formation at 700 feet. No flak, no fighters, just the sound of engines and the hum of a transport aircraft. But everyone knew it was too quiet. As they approached the drop zone, the searchlights appeared again. This time, there were more of them. The German defenses had learned. They were ready. The formation immediately came under fire. Anti-aircraft rounds reaching up at 800–900 feet. Explosions blooming around the aircraft. One C-47 to the left suddenly had a wing section, torn off by a direct hit. The aircraft rolled inverted and descended toward the ground in a death spiral. Turner dove below the flak again. The formation was scattering, individual aircraft breaking away. "All elements, defend yourselves," the lead aircraft called. Turner pushed the C-47 down to 400 feet, skimming over the landscape. He could see the drop zone below, a road, a river, terrain he recognized from the previous drop. "Prepare for drop," Turner called. The cargo doors opened. The supplies were visible through the open doors, crates of ammunition ready to be pushed out. The flak was still coming. Explosions on the ground around the drop zone. German anti-aircraft batteries trying to shoot down the transport aircraft. Turner held the C-47 steady. A shell exploded very close to the aircraft. Turner felt the impact. The fuselage shook. He heard a loud bang from the starboard side. "Damage report," Turner called. "Direct hit in the cargo bay," Patterson reported. "We've got a fire back there." Fire in the cargo bay meant the ammunition might start detonating. It meant the aircraft could become a flying bomb. "Drop everything," Turner commanded. "Get those supplies out now." The supplies tumbled out the back. Crates of ammunition, boxes of food, medical supplies, all falling toward the paratroopers on the ground below. "Cargo doors closing," Morrison called. But the fire was still there. Patterson was already on it, moving toward the cargo bay with a fire extinguisher. Turner got the aircraft away from the drop zone and started climbing toward England. They were lower on fuel now because of the emergency descent, but the port engine was still good. The starboard engine was still functioning. Patterson fought the fire in the cargo bay. It took him 3 minutes of intense effort to extinguish it. By then, the aircraft was over the English Channel. They made it back to England on fumes. Literally. When Turner landed, at the recovery airfield, the fuel gauges showed less than 50 gallons remaining. About 10 minutes of flying time. Turner flew a third mission on June 6th. This time it was gliders being towed. 2 large cargo gliders attached to the C-47 with tow ropes. The gliders were packed with jeeps, trailers, and ammunition. Almost 5 tons of cargo in each glider. Towing gliders was even more dangerous than dropping paratroopers. The gliders were unpowered. Once released, they descended toward the landing zone. If they were intercepted by fighters, they were defenseless. The C-47 towing them was also vulnerable because the gliders slowed it down and made it a bigger, slower target. The flight to the drop zone was tense. The German defenses were still active, still firing, still trying to shoot down American transport aircraft. Turner saw 3 C-47s shot down on the approach to the drop zone. All 3 fell burning. He didn't know if they were from his formation or from another group, but he had to stay focused. He had to release the gliders at the right moment. The drop zone appeared below. Turner lined up on the release point. At exactly the right moment, he pulled the tow rope release handle. The 2 gliders detached. They descended gracefully toward the landing zone, their pilots fighting the controls to steer them to safe landing areas. Turner watched the gliders descend. One glider made a perfect landing in a clear field. The other glider came in too fast and hit a tree line. The glider broke apart on impact. Turner didn't know if the glider pilots and crew had survived the crash, but his job was done. The supplies were delivered. The airborne troops had what they needed to fight. Turner turned the C-47 back toward England. On the flight back, Turner did the math in his head. 3 missions, 3 flights into a combat zone, 3 times that he'd exposed himself and his crew to anti-aircraft fire, 3 times that he'd watched other aircraft burn. How many times could you do this before the odds caught up with you? Per declassified NARA. Records. C-47 pilots on June 6th flew an average of 1.3 missions per pilot. Some flew 2. Some flew 3. A few flew 4. Will Turner had now flown 3. The statistical probability said that the next mission would be the one that didn't come back. But he volunteered for a 4th mission anyway. The 4th mission was canceled. After 3 combat flights on June 6th, Will Turner and his crew were stood down. They'd done enough for one day. Other pilots would fly the later missions. Turner found out later that the 4 C-47s that had volunteered for the 4th mission were all shot down. All of them. 112 paratroopers and supply personnel lost, plus the 20 crew members on the C-47s. If Turner had flown that mission, he would have been killed. Turner continued to fly transport missions throughout the war. After Operation Neptune, he flew supply missions to maintain the airhead in Normandy. He flew transport missions carrying troops and supplies across Europe. By the end of 1944, he'd completed 87 combat transport missions. Per Army Air Force records, that made him one of the most experienced transport pilots in the European theater. But June 6, 1944 was the mission he never forgot. 3 flights into a combat zone, 2 engines damaged, 1 aircraft nearly on fire. 28 paratroopers delivered, supplies dropped, gliders released, and the knowledge that his 4th mission would have been his last. After the war, Turner returned to civilian life. He went to college on the GI Bill. He became an engineer. He worked for an aircraft manufacturer. He married and had children. He lived until 2001, passing away at the age of 84. His obituary in the newspaper mentioned he was a World War II pilot. It didn't mention Operation Neptune. It didn't mention the 3 missions on D-Day. It didn't mention the 4th mission he didn't fly. Most people who knew him never understood how close he'd come to not coming home. The C-47 Dakota continued to fly throughout World War II and beyond. Nearly 10,000 C-47s were built during the war and after. They became the most widely used transport aircraft in history. They flew supply missions. They flew paratroopers. They evacuated the wounded. Per declassified NARA records, the C-47 was responsible for delivering nearly 100,000 paratroopers to combat zones during World War II. Hundreds of those aircraft didn't come back. Thousands of crew members and paratroopers died. But the mission was accomplished. The paratroopers got behind enemy lines. The supplies were delivered. The beaches were secured. And Will Turner got to go home. The C-47 Dakota wasn't a glamorous aircraft. It wasn't a fighter. It wasn't a heavy bomber. But it was the aircraft that carried the men who won the war. It was the aircraft that delivered paratroopers and supplies and ammunition. It was the aircraft that required pilots with steady hands and brave hearts. Will Turner flew 87 combat transport missions. He survived when the odds said he shouldn't have. He came home and lived a normal life, because that's what life demanded. That's the real story of World War II that doesn't make it into the movies. It's not about glamorous fighter pilots. It's not about heavy bombers with famous names. It's about the ordinary men flying ordinary cargo aircraft into extraordinary danger. Men who had to be brave because their paratroopers were counting on them. Men who had to hold formation while being shot at. Men who had to release their cargo even when the aircraft was burning. If this story moved you, if it made you, understand what C-47 pilots sacrificed on D-Day, hit like and subscribe. Because there are thousands more C-47 stories. Thousands of transport missions. Thousands of pilots who delivered the victory and then went home to be forgotten. In the comments, tell me, would you have volunteered for the fourth mission? The one with a statistical 80% chance of not coming back? Next video, we're diving into declassified records of an RAF Dakota crew that survived a mid-air collision at 5,000 feet over occupied France. That story will challenge everything you think about survival. Thanks for watching. Remember the ones we've forgotten, and keep learning about the real heroes, the ones who never got the glory.